The smell of fresh bread and expensive wine filled the air at the Grand Sterling restaurant. It was the kind of place where a single meal could cost more than most people's weekly groceries. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, and soft classical music played in the background. But for Sophie Martinez, it was just another Saturday night at work. She'd been serving tables here for 3 years now. 3 long years of smiling at people who looked through her like she was invisible. 3 years of carrying heavy trays and pretending she didn't hear the rude comments some customers made when they thought she wasn't listening. But Sophie needed this job. She needed every dollar, every tip, every extra shift she could get. At 26 years old, she should have been performing on stages, not serving food on them. That's what everyone told her back when she was younger. Her music teachers said she had a gift. Her college professors called her brilliant. She'd spent years practicing piano until her fingers ached, dreaming of concert halls and standing ovations. But life had other plans. Her father got sick 2 years into her music degree. Cancer, the word that changes everything. The medical bills started piling up faster than snow in a blizzard. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Never enough. Someone had to pay for the treatments, the medications, the specialist appointments that gave them hope. So Sophie made a choice. She dropped out of the prestigious music academy where she'd earned a scholarship. She packed up her dreams along with her belongings and came home. She found work at the Grand Sterling because it paid better than most restaurants. The wealthy customers tipped well when they were in a good mood. Sometimes, the restaurant had a beautiful grand piano sitting in the corner of the main dining room. It was a gorgeous instrument, the kind Sophie used to dream about owning. Black and shiny, perfectly tuned, probably worth more than she'd earn in 5 years. Sometimes, during quiet moments, she'd run her hand along its smooth surface when no one was watching. She never played it, though. That piano was for special occasions, for hired performers during private events. Not for waitresses. Tonight was one of those private events. The entire restaurant had been reserved by some tech billionaire for a business dinner. Sophie's manager had pulled her aside that morning and told her she'd be working the party. "These are very important people," he'd said, adjusting his tie nervously. "Make sure everything is perfect. No mistakes." She'd nodded, like always. Perfect. That's what they always wanted. The guests started arriving around 7, men in suits that probably cost more than her car, women in dresses that shimmered under the chandelier lights. They laughed loudly and talked about things Sophie couldn't relate to. Private jets, vacation homes, stock portfolios, investment opportunities. The man who'd rented the place sat at the head of the long table. He was probably in his early 40s with styled gray hair and an expensive watch that caught the light every time he moved his hand. His name was Daniel Ashworth, though Sophie had to check the reservation list to know that. He was one of those tech guys who'd made billions from some app or website, the kind of person who'd become rich so young that he'd probably forgotten what normal life felt like. Sophie moved between the tables, taking orders and bringing drinks. She smiled politely when they barely acknowledged her. She said, "Of course, and right away, and enjoy your meal," in that pleasant voice she'd perfected over the years. The voice that never revealed what she was really thinking. As the evening went on, the wine flowed freely. The guests got louder, more relaxed. Sophie had worked enough of these events to know how they went. First, everyone would be formal and careful with their words. Then the alcohol would loosen things up. By dessert, they'd either be best friends or arguing about something nobody would remember the next day. She was clearing the main course when she caught herself looking at the piano again. Just for a moment. It was a habit she couldn't quite break. Every time she walked past it, some small part of her remembered what it felt like to play, to lose herself in the music, to express things she couldn't put into words, but that was before. Before the bills. Before the practical choices. Before she learned that dreams don't pay for chemotherapy. Her father was better now, thank God. The treatment had worked. He was in remission, back to gardening and complaining about the government and all the normal dad things. But the debt remained. Student loans from the years she did attend school. Medical bills that insurance had refused to cover. Credit card payments that kept her up at night. So she served food to people who had more money than they knew what to do with. She smiled when they were rude. She laughed at their jokes even when they weren't funny. She played the part of the invisible servant who existed only to make their evening pleasant. "Excuse me, miss?" A woman at the far end of the table held up her empty wine glass. Sophie hurried over, refilling it with a practiced hand. "Thank you, dear." the woman said, though she didn't look at Sophie's face. Her eyes were on her phone, scrolling through something that was apparently more interesting than acknowledging another human being. Sophie moved back toward the kitchen, but something made her glance at the piano one more time. The candlelight reflected off its polished surface. It looked lonely sitting there, silent and unused, kind of like how she felt most days. She pushed the thought away and grabbed another tray from the kitchen. Dessert was next, then coffee, then the bill. Then these people would leave in their expensive cars and go back to their expensive lives. And she'd go home to her tiny apartment and count her tips and hope it was enough to make a dent in what she owed. That's how these nights always went. She had no idea that in less than an hour, everything was about to change. That the piano she'd been avoiding would become impossible to ignore. That one of these wealthy strangers would put her in a position she'd never imagined. Sometimes life gives you a second chance when you least expect it. But first, it has a funny way of making you prove you deserve it. Sophie was bringing out the dessert course when she noticed Daniel Ashworth watching her. Not in a creepy way, but in that curious way people sometimes look at things they're trying to figure out. She kept her expression neutral and placed a chocolate mousse in front of him. "Thank you," he said, still looking at her with that odd expression. She nodded and moved to serve the next guest, but she could feel his eyes following her as she walked around the table. It made her uncomfortable in a way she couldn't quite explain. Then, as she was heading back toward the kitchen, he spoke up. "You keep looking at the piano," Sophie froze. The whole table went quiet, everyone turning to look at her. Her cheeks got hot. She hadn't realized anyone had noticed. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to be distracted." "I'll focus on my service," she said quickly, professionally. No, that's not what I meant." Daniel leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine in his glass. "I'm just curious. Do you play?" The question hung in the air. Sophie could feel a dozen pairs of eyes on her. This was dangerous territory. In her experience, when wealthy people got curious about the help, it rarely ended well. "I used to study music," she said carefully. "A long time ago, really?" Daniel's eyebrows went up. He looked at his guests with a grin. "Well, isn't that interesting? We have a musician serving our dinner." Some of the guests chuckled. Sophie couldn't tell if they were laughing with her or at her. Probably at her. "It was just something I did when I was younger," she said, trying to downplay it. "Can I get anyone more coffee?" But Daniel wasn't letting it go. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe he was just used to getting his way, but he kept pushing. "Come on, you have to play something for us. We'd love to hear it." "Oh, that's really not necessary," Sophie said, her heart starting to pound. "I'm working, and I'm sure you all want to enjoy your evening." "Nonsense." Daniel stood up, gesturing grandly toward the piano. "This is my evening, and I'm saying it would be more enjoyable with some live music. Right, everyone?" A few people nodded politely. Others looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. One older man in the group spoke up. "Daniel, maybe we should just let her do her job." "Her job is to make sure we have a good time," Daniel said, and there was an edge to his voice now. The smile was still on his face, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And I think it would be fun. Come on, just one song." Sophie looked toward the kitchen, hoping her manager would come out and save her from this situation, but he was nowhere to be seen. She was on her own. "I really don't think that's appropriate," she tried again. "I haven't played in years and I'm not prepared." "How hard can it be?" Daniel interrupted. He was enjoying this now, she could tell. It had become a game to him. "You said you studied music. Surely you remember something. Unless you weren't very good." That stung. Sophie felt her jaw tighten. She'd been one of the best students in her program. Her professors had called her gifted. She'd won competitions. But this man didn't know that. And she wasn't about to brag about achievements that felt like they belonged to a different person in a different life. "Daniel, seriously, leave the poor girl alone," a woman at the table said. She had kind eyes and looked genuinely concerned, but Daniel was on a roll now. "I'll tell you what," he said, pulling out his wallet. He took out several $100 bills and placed them on the table. "There's $1,000 here. Play us one song, just one, and it's all yours." Easy money, right? The whole restaurant felt like it was holding its breath. Sophie stared at the money. $1,000. That was almost 2 weeks' worth of tips. That was a full payment on her credit card. That was groceries and gas and maybe, just maybe, a little bit of breathing room. But it wasn't about the money. Not really. It was about the way he was looking at her. Like she was a trained animal who'd do tricks for treats. It was about the smirk on his face that said he already knew she'd say yes because people like her always said yes to people like him. Her manager appeared then, summoned by one of the staff who'd seen what was happening. He hurried over, his face red and anxious. He pulled Sophie aside and whispered urgently, "Just play something, please. We can't afford to upset Mr. Ashworth. He's talking about making this a monthly event. That's serious money for the restaurant." "But I'm a waitress, not entertainment," Sophie whispered back. "Tonight you're whatever keeps the customer happy," her manager said. There was an apology in his eyes, but also a firm instruction. "Please, Sophie, just do this." She looked back at the table. Daniel was watching with that same amused expression, waiting to see if she'd obey. The other guests looked various degrees of uncomfortable, but none of them were standing up for her. The kind woman from before gave her a sympathetic look, but that was all. Sophie felt something shift inside her. Maybe it was the 3 years of swallowing her pride. Maybe it was the exhaustion of pretending she was okay with being invisible. Maybe it was seeing that piano, the instrument she'd once loved more than anything, being used as a prop in this rich man's power play. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe she was just tired of running from who she used to be. "Fine," she said quietly. Daniel clapped his hands together. "Wonderful. See everyone? That wasn't so hard." Sophie walked toward the piano. Each step felt heavy, like she was walking toward something she couldn't take back. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out the bench and sat down. The keys looked just like she remembered. White and black, smooth and cool under her fingertips. She could just play something simple. Chopsticks, maybe. Or Happy Birthday. Something that would satisfy Daniel's demand without revealing too much of herself. That would be the smart thing to do. But as she sat there with all those eyes on her, with that money sitting on the table like an insult wrapped in cash, something else stirred in her chest. It was anger, yes, but it was also something she hadn't felt in 3 years. It was the fierce, burning desire to prove every single person in this room wrong about who they thought she was. Sophie took a deep breath, placed her hands on the keys, and decided that if she was going to play, she was going to play the truth. Sophie's fingers rested on the keys, and for a moment the world went completely silent. Not the restaurant, not really. She could still hear the clink of glasses and the whisper of expensive fabric as people shifted in their seats, but inside her head, everything went quiet in a way it hadn't in 3 years. She knew what piece she was going to play. She'd known the second she sat down. It was the same piece she'd performed at her final recital before everything fell apart. Rachmaninoff's Prelude in C-sharp minor. Dark, demanding, and absolutely unforgiving if you weren't fully committed to it. Her professors had warned her it was too advanced, too emotionally complex for someone her age. But she'd insisted. She'd practiced it until her hands cramped, until she could play it in her sleep, until every note carried a piece of her soul. That was 3 years ago. She hadn't touched a piano since. Behind her, she heard Daniel say something to his guests, probably making another joke at her expense. A few people laughed. That polite laughter rich people do when their host says something that isn't actually funny, but they laugh anyway. Sophie closed her eyes and pressed down on the first chord. The sound that came from the piano was like waking up from a long sleep, deep and ominous and absolutely certain of itself. Her hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. They moved across the keys like they'd never stopped, like the 3 years of serving tables and counting tips had been nothing but a brief intermission. The opening was haunting. It spoke of things that couldn't be said with words: loss, longing, the weight of choices that change everything. She poured it all into those notes. Every bill she couldn't pay, every dream she'd folded up and put away, every night she'd fallen asleep too tired to even cry. The laughter behind her stopped. Sophie's fingers flew faster now, the melody building into something fierce and uncontainable. This was the part where the piece demanded everything from you. No half measures. No holding back. Either you gave it your whole heart or you failed. She gave it everything. Her hands were a blur across the keys. The music filled the restaurant, spilling into every corner, drowning out the background music that had been playing on the speakers. The chandelier crystals seemed to vibrate with each chord. The wine glasses hummed on the tables. This wasn't background music. This wasn't pleasant dinner entertainment. This was 3 years of silence breaking open all at once. She played the way she used to play in her practice rooms at the academy, when it was just her and the piano, and nothing else in the world mattered. She played like her father was in the audience, the way he used to be at all her recitals with tears in his eyes and pride on his face. She played like she was proving something to every person who'd ever looked through her, like she was invisible. The technique was flawless. Her years away hadn't eroded any of the skill she'd built. If anything, the pain of the last 3 years had given her something she didn't have before. A depth of feeling that only comes from real loss, real sacrifice, real life. The piece shifted again, becoming softer but somehow more intense. This was the section that always made people lean forward in their seats, that made them forget to breathe. Sophie's touch on the keys was delicate now, coaxing out notes that sounded like whispered secrets or half-remembered dreams. She was barely aware of her surroundings anymore. The restaurant had disappeared. The guests had disappeared. Even Daniel Ashworth and his condescending smile had disappeared. There was only the music and the feeling of coming home to a part of herself she'd thought was gone forever. In the audience, something had shifted. The smug expressions had melted away. One woman had tears streaming down her face, not bothering to wipe them away. The older man who'd tried to defend Sophie earlier was staring at her with his mouth slightly open. Even the servers who'd been working in the background had stopped to listen, standing frozen with trays in their hands. And Daniel Ashworth wasn't smiling anymore. He was sitting very still, his wine glass forgotten in his hand, watching Sophie play with an expression that might have been shock or might have been shame. Maybe both. The music built to its climax. This was the moment Sophie used to love, where everything she'd been building finally exploded into this massive wall of sound. Her whole body moved with the playing now. Her arms raised and fell. Her back swayed. She wasn't thinking about technique anymore. She wasn't thinking about anything. She was just feeling, and the piano was translating those feelings into something everyone in the room could understand. "This is who I am," the music said. "This is what you almost missed. This is what happens when you see people as entertainment, instead of as human beings with their own stories, their own gifts, their own complicated lives." The final section came too quickly, the way it always did. Sophie wanted to stay in this moment forever, this moment of being fully herself again. But the piece had its own logic, its own ending that couldn't be changed. The notes began to descend, growing softer, pulling back, like a wave returning to the ocean. She played the final chord and let it ring out, her foot on the sustain pedal, letting the sound fill the space one last time before it faded into silence. Then it was over. Sophie sat there, hands still on the keys, breathing hard. She felt like she'd run a marathon. Her heart was pounding. Her whole body was shaking. It had been 3 years since she'd played anything, and she'd just performed one of the most difficult pieces in the classical repertoire. And it had been perfect. The silence that followed was complete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was like the entire restaurant was holding its breath, not sure what to do with what they'd just witnessed. Sophie slowly turned around on the piano bench to face the audience. Her server uniform felt ridiculous now, costume from a play she no longer wanted to be in. She looked at Daniel Ashworth, and for the first time that evening he couldn't meet her eyes. The woman who'd been crying stood up first. She started clapping, slow and deliberate, and then she didn't stop. She just kept clapping, standing there with tears still on her face, applauding like her life depended on it. One by one, the other guests stood up too, even the ones who'd been laughing earlier. Even the ones who'd barely noticed her all night. They stood and they clapped, and the sound was deafening in that elegant dining room. Everyone except Daniel Ashworth, who remained seated, staring at Sophie like he was seeing her for the first time. Sophie stood up from the piano bench. She wasn't sure what happened next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't the same person who'd sat down to play 5 minutes ago. Something had broken open inside her. Something that had been locked away was now free, and there was no putting it back. The applause continued, but Sophie barely heard it. Her legs felt weak as she stood by the piano, trying to process what had just happened. She'd expected to play something simple and walk away. Instead, she'd opened a door she'd spent 3 years trying to keep closed. The woman who'd started the standing ovation was walking toward her now. She was probably in her 50s, elegant in the way that comes from actual grace rather than just expensive clothes. Her makeup was smudged from crying, but she didn't seem to care. "That was extraordinary," the woman said, her voice thick with emotion. I've been to concert halls all over the world, and I've never heard anything quite like that. She held out her hand. My name is Catherine Chen. I'm on the board of the National Arts Foundation. Sophie shook her hand, still dazed. I'm Sophie Martinez. Sophie, where did you study? Juilliard, Curtis. The Westmont Conservatory, Sophie said quietly. But I didn't finish. Catherine's eyes widened. Westmont? I know the dean there. That's one of the best programs in the country. Why on earth didn't you finish? Before Sophie could answer, Daniel Ashworth appeared beside them. He'd finally stood up, though he looked distinctly uncomfortable. The confidence from earlier was gone, replaced by something that might have been embarrassment. That was incredible, he said, and at least he had the decency to sound genuine. I had no idea. I didn't expect. He trailed off, apparently realizing that anything he said would only make him sound worse. Sophie looked at him directly. You didn't expect what? That a waitress might actually be talented at something? A few nearby guests shifted uncomfortably. Daniel's face went red. No, that's not what I meant. You just thought it would be funny to pressure the help into performing for you, Sophie said. Her voice was calm, but there was steel in it. 3 years of swallowing her pride had just come to an end. You threw money at me like I was a circus act. You made me into entertainment. I apologize, Daniel said stiffly. That wasn't my intention. Let me make it right. That $1,000 is yours, obviously, and let me add to it. He reached for his wallet again. I don't want your money, Sophie said. The words surprised her as much as they seemed to surprise him. That $1,000 would have helped. God knows it would have helped. But taking it now felt like accepting his version of the story, that this had all been a fair transaction instead of what it really was. Catherine stepped in smoothly. Sophie, why did you leave the conservatory? You clearly have exceptional talent. Sophie hesitated. This wasn't something she talked about, but something about Catherine's genuine interest and maybe something about having just poured her whole heart out through the piano made her tell the truth. My father got cancer, she said simply. The medical bills were overwhelming. I had student loans already and insurance didn't cover everything. Someone had to work to pay for his treatment, so I left school and got a job. This job. The room had gone quiet again. Everyone was listening now. And your father? Catherine asked gently. He's okay now. In remission. But the debt, Sophie shrugged. It doesn't go away just because the crisis is over. I owe about $80,000 between medical bills and student loans, so I serve tables to people who can spend that much on a single dinner without thinking about it. She hadn't meant for that last part to sound as bitter as it did, but there it was, the truth hanging in the air between them. Daniel looked genuinely stricken now. Several of his guests were staring at their expensive plates, suddenly fascinated by the remnants of their chocolate mousse. Catherine pulled out her phone. 80,000, you said? That's really not why I told you, Sophie said quickly. I wasn't asking for anything. I know you weren't asking, Catherine interrupted, her fingers flying across her phone screen, which is exactly why I'm going to help. Sophie, the National Arts Foundation has a program specifically for talented musicians who had to interrupt their education. We provide full scholarships plus a living stipend. Sophie's heart started to pound again. I don't understand. I'm emailing the Dean of Westmont right now, Catherine said, along with a video that someone apparently took of your performance tonight. She showed Sophie her phone. One of the guests had indeed recorded it, and it was already uploaded to social media. Wait, that's online? Sophie felt dizzy suddenly. With over 10,000 views already, Catherine said, and climbing. Sophie, talent like yours doesn't come along every day. The foundation exists specifically to help people like you. Let me make some calls tomorrow. I can't promise anything, but I think we can get you back to school. I still have to work, Sophie said. I still have bills. The stipend covers basic living expenses, Catherine explained. And there are work-study programs. It won't be easy, but it's possible, if you're willing to try. Sophie felt tears building behind her eyes. She'd gotten so used to closed doors that she'd forgotten what an open one looked like. I don't know what to say. Say you'll let me help, Catherine said simply. Before Sophie could respond, Daniel cleared his throat. I'd like to contribute as well, he said. To the foundation, I mean. For scholarships. For people like Sophie who have real talent but need support. Everyone looked at him. He had the grace to look embarrassed. It's the least I can do. Clearly, I made some very wrong assumptions tonight. About a lot of things, it wasn't quite an apology, but it was close. Sophie could tell it was difficult for him to admit he'd been wrong. People like Daniel Ashworth probably didn't apologize very often. That's generous, Catherine said diplomatically. The foundation always welcomes donors. Sophie's manager appeared then, looking nervous and confused. He'd watched the whole thing from the kitchen doorway. Sophie, is everything all right? Do you need to get back to work? Sophie looked at him. At the restaurant she'd worked in for 3 years. At the uniform she'd worn every shift. At the life she'd built out of necessity rather than choice. Actually, she said slowly, I think I need to give you my notice. The manager's eyes went wide. Your notice? But 2 weeks, Sophie said. That's professional, right? That gives you time to find someone else. But I can't keep doing this. Not after tonight. I have to at least try to go back to music, even if it's terrifying, even if I fail. I have to try, Catherine smiled. You won't fail. Trust me. Sophie wanted to believe her, standing there in that expensive restaurant, with strangers applauding her and promising to help and treating her like she mattered. She wanted desperately to believe that maybe, just maybe, her story wasn't over yet. Maybe it was just beginning again. 3 months later, Sophie stood backstage at the Westmont Conservatory's recital hall, her hands shaking just like they had that night at the restaurant. But this time it was different. This time she was supposed to be here. Catherine had kept her promise. Within a week of that dinner, Sophie had received a call from the conservatory's dean. The Arts Foundation was offering her a full scholarship to complete her degree, plus a monthly stipend that covered rent and basic expenses. There was even a small work-study position helping younger students with their practice sessions. Sophie had worked her final 2 weeks at the Grand Sterling in a daze, barely believing it was real. Her co-workers had seen the video that went viral. Over 2 million views now. Comments from people all over the world saying her playing had moved them to tears, had reminded them of their own abandoned dreams, had made them believe in second chances. Her manager had been surprisingly supportive. I always knew you were too good for this place, he'd told her on her last day. Go make something of yourself. Going back to school at 26 had been stranger than she'd expected. Most of her classmates were 19 or 20, kids who'd come straight from high school with their whole futures ahead of them. Sophie felt ancient by comparison. She'd lived a whole different life in the years they'd been studying scales and music theory, but in some ways that made her better. Her professors noticed it immediately. She played with a maturity that couldn't be taught, only earned through living. The young students played technically well, but Sophie played with soul. She understood what the music meant in a way that only comes from real loss, real struggle, real life. The video from the restaurant had continued to spread. News outlets picked it up. Waitress stuns billionaire with hidden talent, read one headline. The performance that changed everything, said another. Sophie had been interviewed on local news, then regional news, then one of the national morning shows. Daniel Ashworth had made good on his promise too. He'd donated $500,000 to the Arts Foundation, specifically for their interrupted education program. He'd never contacted Sophie directly, which she appreciated, but Catherine told her he'd insisted the donation be used to help people who'd had to choose between their dreams and their family's well-being. He learned something that night, Catherine had said. Not everyone does. Sophie's father had cried when she told him about the scholarship. Real tears. The kind he'd tried to hide during his cancer treatment because he didn't want her to worry. I never wanted you to give up music for me, he'd said. I know, Dad. But I'd do it again in a heartbeat. You're here, you're healthy. That matters more than anything. But now you get both, he'd said, smiling through his tears. You get me and you get your music. That's how it should be. Now, standing backstage, Sophie could hear the audience filling the recital hall. This was her first major performance since returning to school. The fall showcase where advanced students performed for the public, for potential agents, for anyone in the classical music world who might be interested in fresh talent. Catherine was out there somewhere. She'd promised to come. Some of Sophie's former co-workers from the restaurant had gotten tickets too, and her father was in the front row just like he used to be, wearing his best suit and probably already tearing up before she'd even walked out. A younger student, maybe 19, stood nearby looking terrified. It was her first big performance and she looked like she might throw up. "You're going to be amazing," Sophie told her gently. "I'm so nervous," the girl whispered. "What if I mess up?" Sophie thought about that night at the restaurant, about being forced to play when she didn't want to, about choosing to pour everything into the performance anyway, about the moment when fear turned into power. "Nervous is okay," Sophie said. "Nervous means you care. Just remember why you're playing. Not for the people watching. Not for your grade. Play because you love it. Play because you have something to say that words can't express. The rest will take care of itself." The girl nodded, looking slightly less terrified. Sophie's name was called. This was it. She walked out onto the stage and the bright lights hit her face. The audience was a blur of darkness beyond the stage. She could make out her father in the front row, already crying just like she'd predicted. She thought she saw Catherine too, a few rows back. Sophie sat at the piano. It was a beautiful instrument, better than the one at the restaurant, perfectly maintained by the conservatory. Her hands found the keys like greeting old friends. She was playing a different piece tonight. Not the Rachmaninoff, though that one would always be special. Tonight was Chopin's Ballade No. 1. Another difficult piece, but one that told a different story. This one was about transformation, about journeys, about becoming who you were always meant to be. Sophie took a breath and began to play. The music flowed out of her, natural as breathing. She wasn't the girl who'd started at this conservatory 6 years ago, full of talent but untested by real life. She wasn't the exhausted waitress serving people who looked through her. She was both of those people and neither of them. She was someone new, forged by sacrifice and loss and the kind of second chance most people never got. The audience disappeared. The pressure disappeared. There was only the music and the story it told. A story about a girl who'd had to put her dreams away. About a father who'd survived. About a night when everything changed because someone saw her as more than invisible. About finding your way back to yourself when you thought you'd lost the map forever. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the applause came, thunderous and genuine. Sophie stood and bowed, and for the first time in 3 years she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Her father was on his feet, crying openly, not caring who saw. Catherine was standing too, beaming with pride. The other students who'd performed that night clapped the hardest of all. They understood what this moment meant. Later, after the performance, after the congratulations and the photographs, after Catherine introduced her to several people from symphony orchestras who wanted to talk about opportunities, Sophie found a quiet moment alone. She thought about that night at the Grand Sterling, about Daniel Ashworth and his condescending smile, about the way he'd tried to make her play, thinking she was just a waitress who probably knew chopsticks. He'd been wrong about her. But in a strange way, she was almost grateful, because that moment, as awful as it had been, had woken something up inside her that she'd been trying to keep asleep. It had reminded her that giving up your dreams doesn't make them go away. It just makes them hurt more. Sophie pulled out her phone and opened the video from that night. 2.5 million views now. She read through some of the recent comments. "This video made me go back to college after dropping out. I haven't painted in 10 years. Watching this made me buy new brushes. If she can get a second chance, maybe I can too." Sophie smiled and put her phone away. She had rehearsal in the morning. She had student loans to keep paying off, though the scholarship helped. She had a part-time work-study job and a full course load. Her life wasn't perfect or easy, but it was hers, and she was playing music again, and that made everything else worth it. Sometimes life puts you in impossible situations. Sometimes people treat you like you're invisible, like you don't matter. Sometimes you have to set aside your dreams just to survive. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're brave, if you take the chance when it comes, you get to prove everyone wrong, including yourself. Sophie walked out into the cool night air where her father was waiting to take her to dinner. Not at a fancy restaurant where she'd serve other people, just a regular diner where they could celebrate together. As they drove away from the conservatory, past the lit windows where other students were still practicing, Sophie realized something important. That night at the restaurant hadn't ruined her life. It had saved it, and that made all the difference. 2 years had passed since that night at the Grand Sterling, and Sophie barely recognized her own life anymore. She'd graduated from the conservatory with honors, performed in 3 different states, and just signed with a respected classical music agency. But the real change wasn't in her resume. It was in how she saw herself. She was sitting in a coffee shop near the university preparing for a meeting when a young woman approached her table. The woman looked nervous, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Excuse me, are you Sophie Martinez, the pianist?" Sophie smiled. This still felt surreal. "Yes, that's me. I'm sorry to bother you, but I had to say something." The woman's voice cracked a little. "I saw your video 2 years ago, the one from the restaurant. I was working 3 jobs, completely burned out, and I'd given up on my dream of becoming a teacher. Watching you play that night, seeing how you turned that whole situation around, it made me realize I was giving up too soon." Sophie gestured to the empty chair. "Please sit down." The woman sat, words tumbling out like she'd been holding them in forever. "I went back to school. I just finished my teaching credential last month. I start my first real teaching job in 2 weeks. And I know it sounds dramatic, but I don't think I would have done any of it if I hadn't seen your video, so thank you. Really, thank you." They talked for 20 minutes. The woman's name was Lisa, and her story reminded Sophie of her own. Different details, same struggle. Dreams deferred because life got in the way. That desperate feeling of being stuck in a life that didn't fit. After Lisa left, Sophie sat there thinking about all the messages she'd received over the past 2 years. Thousands of them. People who'd gone back to school, picked up instruments they'd abandoned, started businesses they'd been too scared to try. People who saw her story and thought, maybe it's not too late for me either. That was the part nobody had prepared her for. The responsibility of becoming someone's inspiration. Catherine arrived a few minutes later, carrying 2 folders full of papers. They'd stayed in touch, meeting regularly to discuss Sophie's career and the foundation's work. Catherine had become a mentor and more than that, a friend. "Sorry I'm late," Catherine said, settling into her chair. "Traffic was terrible. But I have news you're going to love." "Good news or complicated news?" Sophie asked, knowing Catherine well enough by now to read her expressions. "Both, actually." Catherine opened one of the folders. "The foundation wants to create a new program. We're calling it Second Chance Scholarships, specifically for adults who had to interrupt their education due to family emergencies, medical issues, financial hardship, all of that. And we want you to be the face of it." Sophie's heart started beating faster. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means telling your story publicly, doing interviews, maybe some speaking engagements, helping us identify candidates who deserve support. The donation numbers have tripled since your story went viral, but we need someone who really understands what these applicants are going through. Someone who's lived it." Sophie thought about this. Part of her wanted to just focus on her music, on building her career as a performer, but another part, the part that remembered what it felt like to be trapped and hopeless, knew she couldn't say no. "What about my performance schedule?" she asked. "We'll work around it," Catherine assured her. "This wouldn't be full-time. Maybe 1 or 2 events per month. Some video testimonials. You'd still have plenty of time for your music. Actually, the exposure might help your career too." "I don't want to do it for exposure," Sophie said quietly. "If I do this, it has to be because it actually helps people." Catherine smiled. "That's exactly why you're the right person for this." They spent the next hour going over details. The foundation had already received applications from people all over the country. A single mother who'd dropped out of medical school, a veteran who'd abandoned his engineering degree after deployment, a dancer who'd been derailed by a family crisis. Each story was different, but the thread connecting them was the same. Life had gotten in the way of their dreams, and they needed someone to believe in them enough to give them another shot. "There's something else," Catherine said, pulling out the second folder. "Daniel Ashworth wants to meet with you." Sophie froze. She hadn't spoken to Daniel since that night. Hadn't wanted to. His donation to the foundation was generous, and she was grateful for it, but she'd been perfectly happy never seeing him again. "Why?" she asked. "He's been following your career. He wants to apologize properly. And he has a proposal for you." "Catherine, I don't need his money or his apologies." "I know, but I think you should hear what he has to say. He's changed, Sophie. That night affected him more than you might think." Sophie wanted to refuse, but curiosity got the better of her. "Fine, but you have to be there." They met Daniel the following week at a quiet bistro, nothing like the Grand Sterling. He looked different. Older maybe, or just less arrogant. He stood when Sophie approached, and she could see genuine nervousness in his expression. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," he said. "I wasn't sure you would." They sat down, and for a moment nobody spoke. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "I've thought about that night a lot," he said. "About how I treated you. I was showing off, trying to entertain my guests at your expense. I saw you as less than human, honestly. Just someone there to serve me. And then you played, and I realized I'd made one of the biggest mistakes of my life." Sophie didn't say anything. She wanted to hear what came next. "I started thinking about all the other times I'd done things like that. Not exactly the same, but similar. Treating people as invisible because they weren't in my tax bracket, making assumptions about who matters and who doesn't. It was ugly to see myself that clearly." "So you donated to the foundation," Sophie said. "That's good. That helps people." "It's not enough," Daniel said. "Money is easy for me. I want to do something harder. I want to use my platform to talk about what I did wrong. I want to tell other wealthy people to check themselves the way I had to check myself." He pulled out his phone and showed her a video he'd recorded. In it, he told the story from his perspective. How he'd pressured a waitress to perform. How she'd revealed his own prejudices and blind spots. How he'd been forced to confront the way he treated people he considered beneath him. "I want to post this," he said, "but not without your permission. It's your story, too. If you don't want me to share my side of it, I won't." Sophie watched the video twice. It was honest, uncomfortable, real. He didn't try to make himself look good. He owned his mistakes completely. "Post it," she said finally. "But not for me. Post it because other people need to hear it. People with power need to understand what that power can do to their empathy." Daniel nodded, relief clear on his face. "There's one more thing. I'd like to fund 10 full scholarships through the foundation. In your name. For people specifically coming from service industry jobs who want to pursue arts education." Sophie looked at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. "Not in my name," Sophie said. "In my father's name. Carlos Martinez. He's the one who taught me that dreams matter. Even when life gets hard. Especially then," Daniel smiled. "The Carlos Martinez scholarships. I like that." They talked for another hour. It wasn't friendship exactly. Sophie wasn't sure she could ever fully forgive how that night had started. But it was something. Understanding, maybe. A recognition that people can change, can grow, can learn from their worst moments. When Sophie left the bistro, she felt lighter somehow. She'd been carrying anger about that night for 2 years, and she hadn't fully realized it until now. Letting it go didn't mean what Daniel did was okay. It just meant she wasn't going to let it weigh her down anymore. She had work to do. Scholarships to help award. Performances to give. A whole life to live that was finally, truly hers. Sophie pulled out her phone and called her father. "Hey, Dad," she said when he answered. "How would you feel about having some scholarships named after you?" She could hear the confusion in his voice, then the emotion as she explained. By the end of the call, he was crying again. Happy tears this time. Sophie smiled as she walked down the street. The afternoon sun was warm on her face. Somewhere in the city, someone was probably serving tables, dreaming of something else, wondering if they'd ever get their chance. She hoped they would. She hoped they'd find their own Catherine, their own second chance, their own moment to prove what they were really capable of. And if her story helped even one person believe that was possible, then every difficult moment had been worth it.